right, hello everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for the first virtual webinar of AI and Big Data in Finance Forum in 2024. Today, we are very happy to have Markus Brunnermeier from Princeton to tell us about strategic money and credit ledgers, joined with Jonathan Payne, who's also joining us, and then Péter Kondor from LSE to Discussant. There's going to be a 30 minutes time for the presenter, and then followed by 20 minutes by the discussant. And then it's going to be followed by questions from the audience for 10 minutes. So please send any questions that you have during the talk on the Q&A part. If there are many clarifying questions, I will interrupt Markus once during the talk around minute 15. But questions that involve a longer debate will be deferred to the final 10 minutes or handled by Jonathan on the Q&A. Please also be mindful about your questions. Once the official time hour is done, we're gonna stop the recording, and we hope that you can stay online and join us for an informal follow-up discussion for around 10 to 15 minutes. Now, without further ado, Markus, the floor is yours. Would you like to share your slides?
Thanks a lot, Maryam, and thanks to all of you, Markus, Péter, and Leah, for inviting me to present this paper with Jonathan Payne. Jonathan is here too for handling the Q&A and also for later for the discussion. And the title of the paper is Strategic Money and Credit Ledgers. So if you look at the world we live in, so you see that there's a general trend of more connected record keeping. So the more and more issues are recorded and connected, and so you can actually make automatic payments. So one example are so-called big tech platforms. They offer their own tokens and also consumer credit. Very famously Alibaba and Ant Financial, but Meta tried to do this, Facebook, Amazon, and so forth. You also see supply chains with payments and inventory tracking, automatic contracts. Cornell is one example, the so-called Industry 4.0, that's very prominent as well. So you also see decentralized ledgers with stable coins and smart contracts, Ethereum. This paper will not be about decentralized ledgers, but centralized ledgers. And then there's a lot of debate among governments, whether to introduce CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. And all of these can be digital currencies, they are on a ledger, and they can be connected to other ledgers, so they're part of a bigger ledger universe. So the question we are asking in this paper is that which strategic private players, so not the social planner, will provide such ledgers and has an advantage providing these ledgers? How can this player incentivize agents or users of these ledgers in order to use it? So instead of cash, you use this digital payment ledger. And does this whole thing actually having this digital payment ledger, does it help to expand the contract space? Are certain credit contracts and other things possible which wouldn't be possible otherwise? Okay, so these are the questions we are after. So the model in our model, there's an enforcement and a coordination problem in the model. So the economy consists of producers. They need some uncollateralized loans to produce goods. So there's the legal framework is not perfect. So you need some uncollateralized loans. And there's a centralized common record keeping device. That's our ledger. And this ledger can also be used to create tokens. It settles the transactions and also records the contracts. And you can think of it technologically, it's similar to the famous paper by Kota, Money is Memory. But here, what's different is it's not a social planner setting up this ledger, but it's a privately controlled, some private entity doing it. And it must compete with barter arrangements or cash payments or dollar payments, which are off the ledger. There's certain financial frictions and certain trading frictions. The borrowers can make side trades and default on the initial ledger. So you make some borrowing, you can default on it. And also trading frictions. The platform controls the trading technologies, how to connect various goods traders. So as I said, the key results and the key questions, the key answers, can a ledger improve contracting? We would say yes, if it's backed by a trading platform. So the ledger itself, or the record-keeping device itself, needs a platform to incentivize the use of the ledger, and it works through the threat of exclusion. It can be excluded from the platform. So that also means the platform needs access to the settlement technology to be able to seize resources, and that will be more explicit later on. But essentially, you can think of when you make a payment and you get some revenue later on when you sell your goods, this ledger operator sees the payment goes through this ledger, he can seize and just redirect it for repayment of an earlier loan. Now, the second question was, will the platform provide the ledger? We say yes, platforms have a competitive advantage of providing this ledger. So it will be, what we will see is platforms providing these ledgers and the share of trade. And there will be high markups of increase the profits of these ledgers, but they weaken essentially the incentive constraints for the users to go to this ledger. And there will be most likely only one dominant platform which provides these ledgers. There's some natural monopoly in a sense. But this ledger will use some market power to extract maximum rents. But the maximum rents are limited to the extent that you would like to make sure it's attractive to be in this ledger, and exclusion itself is costly. So that's where the IC constraint comes in. And what's the policy response? Then you should actually, as a policymaker, treat this as a natural monopoly, and we will come back to this at the end. So there's a large literature on this. It connects to various literatures, so on ledgers, contracting, and settlement assets. So it's a lot about settlement. But we have here a large private profit-maximizing institution controlling this ledger. It's connected to this growing literature on digital currencies and currency competition. Again, it is a private entity controlling the digital currency, and also connected to the platform literature. But what the big attempt here is to bring essentially money from an IO perspective into the picture, because there's a private player controlling the money, the digital money. So the way we want to proceed in this presentation is that, okay, first I would like to present a simple 3-period model. It's a real model. And then I will move on to a monetary macro model, which will be an infinite horizon OLG structure model. And then we go to, as a third component, in a third step, I will move to regulatory options. Okay, so the 3-period model is the following. There are 3 periods, because it's a 3-period model. The economy is populated with 2 types of linear utility agents. So everybody is risk neutral in the 3-period model. Later, they will have log utility. The input producers, they just produce input goods, and just have a linear disutility from producing these input goods at time 0. And they're consumed then at time 1. And then the output producers, they buy these input goods. They buy one of the input goods and convert it into an output good. So you take one good and convert it into Z output goods. You buy this input good at time 0, and then at time 1, you get the output good. So you can only consume goods produced by other agents. So if you produce your output good, might want to consume it, but you can't consume your own good. The probability 1 minus beta, these output producers would like to consume at time 1. The probability beta, they want like to consume at time t equals 2. Okay, so these are the output producers. Then there's a trading technology, how they can trade. They can trade through an open public marketplace, and they can also trade through the private platform. But the private platform, that charges a markup of mu. Okay, and where they can trade in this 3-period model is given by a probability, an exogenous probability eta. The probability eta, you trade in the private platform. Probability 1 minus eta, you trade in the open public marketplace. Later, this will be in the more full model, it will be an endogenous choice. There are 2 payment technologies. You can essentially do a spot trade, a spot payment. So they're not recorded and they're settled immediately. That's essentially a barter arrangement. And then there's a centralized ledger payment that records and executes contracts. And the IOU holders, so if I'm one of the input producers, I sell you the input good, I get an IOU, I hold the input, I can redeem then this IOU later on. And then this IOU is then settled of this ledger contracts when the contracts occur. So the producers who trade through the ledger cannot default because the ledger takes the resources away. And I will show this in a minute how this works. If the producer, the output producer can default, if it defaults, then we assume after defaulting, you get, psi of z. D was the output size, and a fraction psi you can keep it if you default. So you don't get everything, you only get the fraction psi. So 1 minus psi is a dead weight loss. So you can see in this picture, so just to show this whole thing graphically, so you can see that the input producer, he produces an input good with and then trades it for an output producer. The output producer then produces something at time 1, he gets a z or z output goods. So from one input good, output good. But of course, the output producer, in what we assume, has no funding, so he has to essentially borrow from the input producers by issuing an IOU and promises an interest rate, a cross interest rate of R. Now, the input producer wants to consume in the period 1, while the output producers, they consume with probability 1 minus beta at time 1, and probability beta they consume at time 2. Okay. Now, what happens at time 1, then the input producer says, or comes to the output producer, I would like to have this IOU, please pay me now what you promised me they are. And possibly, that's why this is dashed line, then the output producer says, yes, I pay you this, this what I promised you, and you give me the IOU back, okay? Or alternatively, it might default and is not paying, okay? That's just how the trading occurs. Now, overall, there will be a ledger in this economy, and this ledger is recording things. In particular, it's also recording the IOUs, so they are recorded in this ledger. And then we also have, as I said earlier, we have this marketplace where the trading occurs and the platforms. And as I said, with probability eta, you trade on the market, on the platform, 1 minus eta exogenously, you trade at the open marketplace. That's the O stands for that. And that's if you want to consume, if you're an output producer, consume at time 1, you do this at time 1. If you want to consume at time 2, you do this at time 2. That's the same, similar structure. Now, what's special about a platform and the ledger, if the IOU is recorded in the ledger and the platform is handling that, or when you sell the product, so the output producer sells his product, gets the price of the product, then immediately the ledger says, you owe R to the input producer, takes it away, and only gives you the rest. Okay, and that's what they can consume. So the settlement, everything is done automatically. If you go through the market, it is possible that, the IOU comes and then you default on it. Okay, you cannot default really in equilibrium because the ledger is just automatically paying off the debt for you. Now, what happens if you're a late consumer? So if you happen to be a late consumer and you were to default, then you could still be that you want to later on trade on the platform because exogenously you pick to trade on the platform. And if you default, if the platform, the ledgers are one entity, then the platform can say you cannot trade anymore. Okay, and then you're out in the cold pretty much because you defaulted on it, but then you can't trade anymore because the platform is excluding you from the trading because it's punishing you from defaulting. So that's how the model works. So that's everything is put together. So what's important is there is some settlement of the IOUs, but there's some trading beforehand. Some of the trading happens before the settlement. Some of the trading happens after settlement. If you trade through the platform, automatically the money is taken away. So the platform, the ledger, there's some coordination on this element possible. And if you trade later on, there's the exclusion power, which, makes sure that you don't default here. And as you can imagine, if it's done this way, the right way, then it will be the case that the output producer does not want to default, and hence he can borrow in the first place, which he couldn't do. And then if he can't borrow because everybody anticipates he is defaulting, then there would be no production in the first place. So essentially, if you have an independent platform, an independent ledger controller, so two independent things, then it wouldn't work. So you really need the cooperation between ledger and the trading controllers. So if they don't coordinate on exclusion, then all producers will essentially default and there's no production. So why is that? If the ledger automatically enforces contracts, but the platform allows agents to undertake spot payments, so if the platform is not connected to the ledger and allows them to undertake spot payments, then the ledger is never used. So why should we use this ledger in the first place? And so it's not automatically enforced. So that's the ledger and the platform, they need each other. So the platform attempts to enforce contracts. So when the producer trades before the contract settlement, then the platform automatically passes on the seized sales revenue to the creditor. So there's no default. If the producers trade after the contracts, because it happens with beta probability, then the platform can, if the platform and the ledger work together, they can threaten to exclude from this trading, and then you can't trade with probability eta if you can only trade through the platform. And so that essentially means that, if you have some unbacked common ledger, it will not work. It's only working if you combine the two entities, the platform and the ledger, in order to have some active thing going on. Now, so once you see that, it actually, the only way you can really increase the enforcement possibility is to have the platform, the ledger, to be in one entity, to work together. Then the next question is, how much rent can this platform, then the platform is essentially in the ledger, they are monopolists, how much rent can they extract? And essentially the outcome is, so if the platform provides a ledger, then for large ethers, so when ether is very large, so most of the trades, the probability that you have to trade through a platform is very high, then actually the platform, together with the ledger, can extract a lot of rents, but there's a limit to it, and the limit is given by this markup at time 2, by this expression. And what this says is, if you charge too high a markup, then you don't worry to be excluded later on. So you have to make sure that exclusion is still biting. So the basic trade-off, the platform wants to increase the markup to make more profits, but if it charges too high a markup, then the customer or the output producers don't care that they will be excluded. So there's an IC constraint, so the platform has to stay attractive to satisfy the IC constraint. So the markup is bounded from above by this expression here. So for large enough ether, if most of the trades happens to the platform, then everything is fine. There's no default. Credit is granted, is extended in the initial period. Everything works, and it's actually also the case that the amount of the size of the markup for the platform is limited through this incentive constraint. If eta is sufficiently low, the platform does not set up a ledger in the first place to enforce contracts. So that essentially means there will be no lending going on and no credit extension, and that's why the whole system does not work. So there's only essentially the dominant trading platform will be set up in the ledger, and the monopoly extraction is limited by this IC constraint. Now, this was the 3-period model to give you the basic idea. Now, there was no real money in it. So now we would like to set up a monetary macro model in order to illustrate this in an infinite horizon model and have some additional results of that. So what the goal of this full model is to study the feedback between payment and trading systems in a macro model. So now we allow agents to choose where to trade on the platform or the open marketplace. So there's an endogenous eta, which was before it was exogenous. We introduce a settlement asset using some currency, either cash or IOUs. And we introduce some savings in the financial intermediaries. So people save through financial intermediaries. We call them funds. And we also make the size of the project flexible. So the project size might go up and down. So far, it was just fixed at normalized at 1. And of course, if you charge now a higher markup, the whole production size might scale back. So there's some additional margin there too. And then later on in the final section, we'll also allow for other platforms to provide ledgers as well. So there's not only one platform, there might be 2 platforms competing. That's in the next section. Now, what's the OLG model? We have discrete time infinite horizon OLG model with one consumption good, and people live for 3 periods. So the agents start as producers and then become log utility consumers. So at age 0, you're born, you have an idea, but you have no resources, you have to borrow, and you convert essentially X input goods into Y output goods. So these are the same goods, same good, but that's your production technology. It's concave with alpha, exponent of alpha, and Z is your productivity. Then at time 1, you have produced something, you can sell it and sell your goods, And you might consume something, depends what your preferences are. You might also consume a part of it only in time 2 and then exit. But you consume, you repay or default on the IOUs from time 0 and so forth. What we add to this, in each age, agents choose the trading technology. So whether they go to the open market or to the platform, depends a little bit what your amenity shocks are. It's a discrete choice between open markets and platforms. So we use from this discrete choice literature extreme value search amenities. And this is given by this Gumbel distribution, where this gamma parameter later will be the demand elasticity. I will come back to that. And there's something which is technologically specific, and then there's something which is given by this Gumbel parameter here, which will turn out in a demand elasticity. The elasticity of substitution at age tau. Now, let me show this in pictures again. Oops, sorry. Okay. So here what we have, the OLG structure. So time is running. It starts at -infinity to +infinity. Each time there's a morning and an evening. But if you think about generation T, for example, generation T is born. It has born with an idea. It has a production function, but no input. So it has to get some inputs from that. And then it has an output. And then it consumes some of this output, not its own output, but it has to buy from somebody else. And then, it gives something back to the old generation, from which it was borrowing. And actually, some of the goods are used as input goods for the next generation to produce again. Okay, there's only one good, but the same good is used for production as an input and also consumption. So that's what's going on. So everything repeats itself this way. Now, the environmental, the currencies, so far, I haven't talked much about the currencies. There's the money supply is M bar to the economy, just some constant money supply. And the payments technology, the two payments technologies are settled using financial assets. Okay, there are spot transactions. They have a resource in advance constraint. It's like a cash in advance constraint. So a fraction kappa of the payments must be made using public money and or barter. Okay, so that's essentially some cash in advance constraints. So if you go through the spot market, you have to hold some cash in your wallet in advance, and there's a demand for money for that. Now, if you go through the digital ledger, that's the difference. You don't have this resource in advance constraint because everything is written on a ledger, everything is recorded there, so you don't have to hold money in it. So the agents pay on the ledger using tokenized claims to any non-risky future income on the ledger. So in aggregate, there's no risk in this model at all. Let me also say what this epsilon is. This epsilon essentially is a price, that's an exchange rate between the price on the marketplace divided price on the platform. Okay, so that's what this epsilon will be. And there's a continuum on what we also introduce, a continuum of competitive mutual funds. So funds, or think of banks that pool the resources across agents. So they issue deposits, make loans, hold money reserves, and so forth. And the whole idea is to set up a system, a ledger, such that the funds exclude defaulting agents. So what can happen is that an agent says, okay, oops, I default, I keep the money, and then the agent has to park his funds with somebody for one period, and then all the funds coordinate and no, we don't take people who defaulted. Okay, people who defaulted, we don't take. And that's the system is set up, the ledger is set up in such a way that all funds coordinate not to accept defaulting agents. Okay, so let me go back to the picture again. Okay. Or the payment flows, that's essentially what you have here. I had the goods flows before. You just pay here with IOUs, and then the IOUs are coming back together with the dollars, and you get IOUs from the new guys. So everything is canceled, is then settled again, and this essentially works through the funds. And as I said, the funds, they have some cash, some official cash, some dollars, and they have some IOUs, which these guys park for a period. The funds also hold some platform shares. So the platform itself is generating some revenue, some profits. That's also held by the funds. And then on the liability, they have deposits, and these deposits are then used to pay back. So everything is going into every period you can think of a new fund being set up, And this way, all the payments are made through the funds. The funds essentially are a vehicle to store your wealth for one period. Okay, that's a model. And so we put the whole thing together, and due to time constraints, I won't be able to really spell out all the math. So let me just show you some interesting results which comes out of this model. So all the insights which are in the 3-period model, of course, are also in the OLG model. And it's also the case that now eta is endogenous and so forth. But one interesting thing I would like to highlight is that, well, how does the markup, the change in the markup for the platform, how does it change the whole outcome? So this is a fraction of agents which go to the platform, and 1 minus eta is the fraction which go to the open marketplace, the public marketplace, and dollars. So what you can see in the general equilibrium, if you increase the markup, if the platform says, okay, I increase the markups, I charge higher markups. So if you move over there, it is the case that the interest rate is going up, okay? So why is that? And that's an interesting, was surprising to us why that's the case. What happens if people use, if the markup goes up, then individuals will use more the public marketplace, the open marketplace, rather than the platform. But if they use the open marketplace, they will hold cash in advance, and they don't hold these IOUs, but the IOUs provide some funding for the lending aspects. So there will be less IOUs parked with the funds, so the funds have fewer resources to really lend out, and that's why, you know, there's the amount of savings is lower, and everybody wants to borrow. If people go away from the platform, that means that the interest rate is going up. That's essentially what you see here. So so you can see this as well. If the markups go up, fewer and fewer people go to the platform in the H1 and H0, at H1 and H2. So it's always fewer and fewer people go to the platform. And that essentially means there's less saving through the funds, and hence there's less possibility to give the lending so that the interest rate is moving up, and that leads to this case. So this also affects then also the exchange rate between the price of the good on the platform relative to the price on the good on the public marketplace, and it also affects the whole lending activity in the economy. The total output and all this is also going down significantly as mu is going up. Now, so far, I've just said for different mu's what happens, but the platform has to choose the mu. So the platform is choosing the mu, and we assume that the platform is choosing a sequence of mu's for all future to maximize the equity price by solving, you know, the equity price just the future profit using the household's SDF, because ultimately the households own the platform, taking into account the agent's choice and the equilibrium prices, and it takes given the interest rate. And that's what we do for the platform. And what's interesting is that what you see is that what you should choose and what the outcome will be. So, for example, what the markup will be depends to a large extent what the elasticities is. And here we plotted with respect to the elasticities gamma 2. Let me remind you what is this gamma 2. Gamma is that I'm saying, should I go to the platform or should I go to open marketplace? And what's my elasticity of substitution between the two? I get an amenity shock, which says I really get a big shock to go to the marketplace or to the public to the platform. Let's say then I want to go, and the prices, the markup has to react a lot in order to make me really go to the other place, because get this huge benefit from being on the platform. And the distribution, this extreme value distribution, the parameter here gives me the elasticity of substitutions here. And these are different. This is just how the markup then changes if the elasticity changes. So you can see as the elasticity changes, it is the case that the exchange rate changes, and also how people react, to what extent they will go to the different places. But what's important is, as I change the elasticity, it is also the profit opportunities for the platform is changed. Of course, if there's high elasticity of substitution, the platform has less market power. And there's also a sense of fragility. So you can see that, you know, if the gamma 2 is very high, but then it can be that the value function for the platform can go negative. That means it's very hard for the platform to incentivize people to come to itself in order to make positive profit, because the platform has to stay attractive. There's an incentive constraint. The platform has to stay incentive to be possible to extract if it cannot, provide an attractive option, then also has not the exclusion power, and it needs the exclusion power in order to keep it attractive. So let
Markus,
me just.
You have 1 minute.
Yes, sorry. So the additional lessons from the macro version. So the general equilibrium interest rate, I think, is a very interesting thing because it locks in the agents. So if you have higher markups, then actually you make the whole credit market. There's not enough savings going on through the IOUs. That changes the interest rate, as I mentioned before. A second interesting aspect is, remember, there was a phenomenon that 1 minus beta was consumed at time 1, at age 1, and beta was consumed at time 2. If beta is 1, everybody wants to consume only at age 2, and that means they want to park money. And if there's no money or the beta is 1, then the agents can never default because you rely really on this ledger to really park your money. So first you borrow with the ledger, and then you need the ledger to save. And if you default on it, you're excluded from the saving. So you're locked in this as well. And the other thing is how you would like to minimize the rent extraction of the platform depends very much on this gamma 2 parameter. And it's ideally, from a planner's perspective, you would like to put the rent extraction or the rent, the platform gets close to 0, but depends very much on this gamma 2. So this gamma 2 is hard to, to see exactly what the gamma 2 is in the real world. Now, what are the regulatory options? So what we do in the paper then, and I just say two things. You can regulate platform competition if you have a setting with 2 platforms, 1 and 2 competing with each other, or you can provide a public option. So far, the public option was just dollars and the open marketplace. We could say, oh, we also do CBDC, we open the Fed Now system, and we have a public option. And the public option is a ledger, public ledger, essentially allowing all this lending going on. Now, if the public option does everything what the private platform does without rent extraction, of course, it is better. But what happens then the private platform becomes essentially the outside option, and it becomes the black market. So the private platform has incentive to create a black market. So I don't have time to go through that. Let me conclude. So ledgers will be provided monopolistically by trading platforms. There will be no separate specialized ledgers. That's what our model predicts. What's important is that these ledgers coordinate among the banks, among these funds, not to accept agents who defaulted on other banks. Okay, so that's the idea. The platform's rent extraction is limited to ensure that the platform is sufficiently attractive so it hurts when you exclude it. So that's important. So that limits rent extraction. But to get this right, that the rent goes to 0, that's very tough. If people want to consume later in life, as age 2 only, there's a lock-in effect. That simplifies the enforcement and also increases rent extraction for the platform. And then I mentioned at the end the competing platforms, how to regulate competing platforms. I could only allude to that. And one way to compete is to provide a public option which competes like CBDC, Open Fed Now, and so forth. And that provides some alternative. But then, the private platform essentially becomes the outside option. It becomes the place to do a black market. It becomes the bad boy, essentially. Because in a case where the CBDC is not set up in such a way that essentially it can force everybody to go through the CBDC and not go anybody else. So the private platform has incentive to provide an outside option. So let me leave it at that. And thanks a lot for everybody for listening to us. I'm looking forward to Peter's comments and everybody's questions.
All right. Peter, do you want to share your slides? Thanks so much, Markus. And yes, now it's time for Peter.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I hope everybody can see my slides. I'm a little bit of an outsider, but hopefully there will be something which is neither crazy nor trivial. We'll see. Okay, so the topic is super interesting. So we all know that we might be close to the technical possibility that every transaction being recorded on a digital ledger, payment related to credit production, consumption might be accessed to others, and contracts could condition transfers on all that information. So looking at the process from an IO perspective, but it naturally converges to with and without regulation is interesting and super important. Okay, so what does Markus and Jonathan do? So let me start with the two-period model. So the basic setup is that in period 0, we have an input which is provided in exchange of IOUs, and this is recorded on a ledger. And then in period 1, we have the producers, the main agents, who generate some Z output out of that input, and they either default on those IOUs or pay back. Then with probability beta, they want to trade in period 1. With a further probability eta, they will trade on the platform because this is where they will have their counterparty, or with 1 minus eta on the spot market. With probability 1 minus beta, they store their goods and trade only in period 2, where again, with probability eta, they will trade on a platform with 1 minus eta on a spot market. So far, so good. So platform is an agent who chooses the fraction of profit which it extracts from trades in both periods. This is mu1 and mu2. And they can choose to enforce the repayment by using the ledger and taking repayment automatically from revenue from sales from period 1 traders and excluding defaulters from period 2 trading on the platform. So they can choose to do all of that or not. They can also pick and choose, but that basically that will be their main choice, whether to enforce repayment or not. So the main result is that there is an upper threshold, mu2, which limits how much producers will extract, the profit they will extract from trade, and the idea is that that limit has to be there because if they extract too much, then there won't be sufficient benefit of trading on the platform to make not defaulting attractive for the producers. So that's basically the IC constraint. If this is a positive number, the platform enforces repayment, which in the language of Markus and Jonathan uses or provides a ledger. Otherwise, all producers default. There is no lending, no production, no trade. If this is a negative number, then there is just no feasible way to get profit out of this system. So the platform doesn't enforce repayment and the ledger is not used. That's kind of the essence of the two-period model. Okay. So what is kind of the intuition here? So it helps me to think about the ledger as a contractable credit history. And then the question is that the idea is that the Amazon can choose to require sellers to maintain good credit history. What does it mean? They can deduct outstanding installments from sales automatically and exclude from future trades on the platform anyone who defaulted to their bank. Now, the question is, would Amazon want to do that? And the answer from the model is that yes, because the monopoly is big, it internalizes the effect that without repayment, there is no credit, no production, no trade. That's kind of the main force of why the Amazon is providing the ledger. Okay, so here is my first comment. If you think about this, it requires deep strategic thinking and commitment power from Amazon. So basically what is happening here is that they have to deny serving profitable customers ex post to benefit from the equilibrium improvement in financial discipline in the whole economy. So if it's kind of, there is a renegotiation problem, which you have to kind of have the commitment power to kind of get rid of it. Because if somebody is default, it's still for Amazon, it's still a profitable customer, but you have to say, no, you cannot trade because I want this high financial discipline in the whole economy because this is what makes my economy tick. Okay, so that's a question whether this is the intuition what we want for the ledger. But what is kind of really striking me is that I thought that there is a much more natural agent who would want to provide this ledger, and this is the bank. So why the platform is the agent and not a bank. So I was kind of thinking is that it would be very natural to introduce a repeated need of credit, and then there is a bank, and instead of this abstract notion of lending and borrowing. So if there's a decision maker bank, he can exclude defaulters if they default from future credit contracts. And use credit history and ask other banks to use credit history, and they ask all other banks, and presumably all the banks would be happy to use credit history and report their defaults to that credit history because they're directly incentivized to do so. So they don't have to kind of rely on this externality argument. They have like a very direct motivation to do so. So I would think that the bank is the most natural user and provider of the ledger and not a platform. And I was kind of surprised that it's not in the model. Probably it's somewhat there in the dynamic one, but it's kind of not really turning up because it opens up very relevant questions. Should the platform merge with the bank, as in big tech? And then this platform bank now has clear and direct incentives to do the ledger for program repayment. It would lead to cheaper due diligence, higher profit, more credit, and so on. You could also question whether they are too powerful now. I mean, these platform banks, I mean, I will talk about this a little bit later, that they kind of sound like a super powerful instrument. So a lot of questions are coming up, which for me are very natural. You can think about the I/O questions, I think, in a more efficient way, because then you would have banks, platform banks together, and you could ask a question that whether they want to share the ledger or providing their own, whether they want to kind of have a public provision of ledger instead, and so on and so on. So it kind of, even in this two-period setup, once you would introduce banks, I think it would be kind of more natural, and a lot of things come out. Okay, so this was comment one. Okay, so dynamic model, a lot of things are happening there. So there is an endogenization of the scale of production, the choice of platforms versus the spot market. The main result there is that if the extracted rent is large, the scale of production suffers, and it limits how many people are trading on the platform. So there is this kind of feedback. Then there is a monetary part, which requires a lot of machinery. So you need the cash in the advance constraint, you need the money itself, you need tokens for the platform transactions, you need endogenous interest rates on each, endogenous exchange rate across token and money and prices between these different platforms. So it's a huge machinery. And it does give you GE effects. I might not have captured all of them, but my idea is that basically what is happening is that if the rent is high on the platform, you would substitute away. However, because of the general equilibrium effect, if many agents are doing that, that effectively raises the price of substituting away, and that limits this substitution somewhat. Something along that line seems to go on. And then you have the full OLG dynamics, and then you get the result if the money is limited substitute and there is a strong desire of saving, you would get the IOU essentially work as a Tirol-like bubble. So the idea would be is that you can sustain the value of this IOU because this is the way to transfer resources across generations, which is super important, and that kind of sustains the value. And there was a good word, which I don't remember what Markus used for that effect. Okay, so second comment, perhaps because of my own limitations, I wasn't extremely convinced that the additional results, which are coming out from this super complex machinery, are far enough from standard arguments to validate the large machinery. That's to make it clear. So it's very apparent that you guys have the ambition to have this framework, and probably at some point this framework will be super interesting and very exciting. You can see that there are interesting questions to ask. what happens, will be the effect of monetary policy on competition, the viability of ledger and tokens, and so on and so on. So you can see that once you have a working monetary model, there are space for a lot of analysis, but they don't seem to be asked yet in the version which I saw. The extensions actually are going back to the two-period model and working with that again. So I kind of had this feeling, and it might not be fair, it might be just because I didn't understand everything, that this complex monetary machinery has a little bit of Chekhov's pistol effect, that you know, he said that if in the first act you have hung a pistol on the wall, then in the following one it should be fired. So I kind of felt it was not fired, or it was fired, but I didn't notice. So I think it needs a little bit more clearer argument that why we need this complex machine. So in the current version, I kind of have that feeling that if we would extend the two-period model, probably without the monetary part, but with scale and endogenous eta, then it will be probably more effective. Okay, so further comments a little bit outside of the model. This ledger does have this base infrastructure feel. So you can kind of feel that it is important to have there. It's very efficient to have there, even outside of the platform bank sphere. So if you have two small firms, they want to contract with each other. One of them is upstream, providing input for the downstream firms, and the downstream firm pays after sales, so there is trade credit. This automatically enforced payment condition on sales would save a lot of paperwork, legal costs, collateral capital. It just like sounds very effective. Also, you do have this feel that you need only one good working ledger would be enough. Like parallel construction seems inefficient, like railway network. So it's really like base infrastructure. And that's why this natural monopoly idea or public provision sounds very reasonable question. And the paper raises some issues with that. It puts a lot of emphasis on monopoly rent. It puts a little emphasis on well, it mentions privacy concerns. So in the rest of the discussion, I just want to tell you about my worries, but why like what other things I'm worried about this. Okay. So one of them is the incentives to innovate. So arguably, the reason why we arrived to this fintech and big tech revolution is because these big monopolistic banks had very little incentives to innovate, especially on the customer experience side. So we have, until very recently, or even until now, we have expensive and slow electronic transfers, both within and across countries. It's extremely difficult to get in a standard bank to get the policy rate on your savings. Instead, you are getting near zero. You have to transfer your money to a fintech company and then put it into a money market ETF. It's very, some people call it deposit franchise. I would call it outrageous, but that's what is happening. So you can kind of see that they are not very inventive on helping the customers. So one worry is that if this digital ledger will be in the hands of monopolistic agents, whether it's a platform or a bank, whether the technology will be pushed forward or whether it just stops developing and we will get back to our old world of poor experience for the customer. Now, the other one is that this access to a programmable ledger where a broad range of customers' transactions can be observed and conditioned on. There are privacy concerns, but for me, more importantly, this sounds like an unprecedented amount of power. It's like a very powerful, this platform bank who can do all of that sounds like a very powerful player. And then I'm really worried about the problem of incomplete contracts, right? So think about a debate when the contract didn't specify some kind of an environment, and that's why the platform claims that the customer has to pay more, and the customer claims that he doesn't have to pay more. So today what happens, the bank platform can probably exclude that customer and can initiate a legal process. In this bank platform world with direct access to the ledger, they can just collect immediately, or they can just freeze the account at will. And would be really worried, given the experience what we have with these big, large monopoly institutions, and that they would do it, and then they would ask questions. And then you have contracts, laws, regulation, customer protection to help. But if all of that becomes exposed, if your money is already collected, if your account is already freezed, if you cannot pay your electricity bill because that is on the same ledger which somebody froze, that will become very, very hard. So this kind of dominant position makes it like really scary at some point. Okay, so this is all what I wanted to say. So it's a very interesting line of research. It's a super relevant topic. I suggested that some ingredients should be included, like banks, and others should be probably cut, like the monetary machinery. Overall, it's a recommended read, especially the next version.
All right, thanks so much, Peter and Markus. So to all the audience, if you have questions, please raise your hands and I'm going to call on you, because if you don't ask questions, I'm going to take all the remaining 25 minutes single-handedly. But before we go to audience questions or like anybody in the panelists, Markus, you want to take a couple of minutes to respond to Peter's comments?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Peter. It was a fantastic discussion, and I think Jonathan can probably jump in as well. Let me just, very valid points. The commitment problem, yes, I think we assume that the platform or the ledger can commit to certain things. But if the bank were to do it, you have to assign the same commitment power to the bank. I mean, you alluded to repeated structures, but then, we can also say, oh, the platform has a repeated structure as well. But generally, we would argue that what the platform can do on top of a bank is that it can exclude from trading. So the bank cannot do that. So in a sense, the platform has more than what the bank has. Okay, so that's what we excluded. Again, so and it could be that the platform and the bank unify too. So the platform can then exclude not only from trading, but also from future credit and all these things. In our model, strictly speaking, you only have to borrow once. You don't have to borrow. But we think there's a huge literature already on banking from being excluded from future borrowing. But in general, I think probably you should, think a little bit more how the banks play in this. Our funds, essentially, you can think of banks in a sense. About the dynamic setting, it's indeed so we put the monetary setting on top of it. So in order to highlight the difference between, the open market where you have just, cash in advance or resource in advance, and then you have the ledger where you don't need that. The sharp contrast is very things. I don't think there's any Tyrol type bubble in our setting. So we don't have anything like this. What's going on is that there's some borrowing, or there's some, when you store your wealth in IOUs, you essentially lend to some others. And if you hold your wealth in cash, you don't lend to somebody. And that changes the interest rate a lot. So if the platform charges high markup, people don't want to use the IOUs so much. So essentially, they don't store their wealth in IOUs. So saving is much more scarce, and that leads to a much higher interest rate. And this, I think, comes from this behavior rather than any bubbly story. But I don't see how one could do this with endogenous interest rate without spelling out the whole GE setting. And I also agree very much with your broader issues. So we also think the platform is a natural monopoly. And of course, there are a lot of other dimensions. And with any public sector taking over some infrastructure, the innovation is going down. I totally agree with that. And the dominance of this one player, perhaps it should be a government-run entity then. But we didn't go into this. We just wanted to highlight certain aspects. But there are a lot of open issues and important regulatory issues. Jonathan, do you have?
I think the question is, where is it hard to have substitution in the economy? So we have a lot of models where there are banks, and the banks enforce exclusion from credit. In these models, there's usually a magic step where all the banks commit to agree to coordinate on exclusion, even though they'd all individually like to sort of deviate from that. So one question is, how do you get the banking sector to coordinate to do that if there's not some large player like a platform to step in and do it? And the second question is, what is it hard to substitute from? So if you're getting credit from one lender and then they say, I'm going to exclude you from my personal credit service, is it difficult to get someone else to give you credit or not? Versus if you have a platform and they say, well, we control a large share of trade in the economy, and then we say you can no longer trade, how easy is it to go off Alibaba and try to go to a different trading service? So I think for thinking about who has the real advantage to provide this ledger, you need to think about how you overcome the coordination issue. And secondly, where is it really difficult for agents to substitute from? So if you think that it's really difficult to substitute in the credit market, and I'm an individual bank and I provide a credit, and it's incredibly difficult to go and get credit from anybody else, then I think the bank could play this kind of role. Or if you think it's frictionless for all the banks in the economy to just coordinate on exclusion, even without a government stepping in and sort of forcing them to coordinate on exclusion, then again, I think the banking sector can do it very well. But what we try to point out here is that having a large trading platform being able to step in and act as this role to coordinate the system is very helpful for trying to get all these banks to do what they would like to do, but get them to coordinate on it. I guess that's what we're trying to tease out in this paper.
All right, so let me start asking my questions, and then I swear I'm going to only ask two, and then I'm going to shoot the rest of an email to Markus. So the first question is more like maybe like semantics, but at least right now in the economy, the role of ledgers is not to produce IOUs. The role of ledgers is to create the truth. Okay, so so in all, like, which you said you don't want to talk about, like the point stuff and all of these things, the idea is that usually the truth is written by like some centralized government. Ledgers is a decentralized way to create the truth rather than actually creating a commitment mechanism, or what Jonathan mentioned, a coordination mechanism. So I was kind of wondering why you call this a ledger rather than like relating to what Peter said. I guess the way to some degree the financial market works on this is credit scores. Okay, so the credit score is a coordination tool. We assign credit scores somehow, maybe, and then all banks commit to it. Why do they commit to it? Because there's a self-selection. If I know that this bank does not, if I default on it, it's gonna still give me credit, then everybody who's more likely to default is gonna select into that bank. So that bank is hurting its own future opportunities, and that creates a self-imposing commitment structure because of the huge heterogeneity in borrowers. So that was my first question. And kind of my second question was related to your kind of big dynamic model, which was a lot of what you pointed out, which I think is very interesting, is higher rents have two forces. One is that it reduces the quantity. Second, that it increases the price. Okay, and they go the opposite way. So first question, what is the endogenous thing that controls this trade-off? Is it the Gumbel shock? Is it the Gumbel parameter gamma 2? And what does it mean? And two, what is the economic environment, at least, that makes the whole aggregate thing go one way or the other?
Okay, thanks a lot, Maryam. So essentially, I agree with you that it's important that the ledger is recording the truth, then there's truth reporting, so there's an IC constraint. In our setting, essentially, you can cheat in terms of defaulting. So we have an IC constraint not to default. You can always say, oh, I get the revenue, I borrowed something, I sell my output, I get some revenue. I go to another bank and said, I paid back my loan, don't worry, and you cheat this way. And then the other bank just, says, okay, you can park your revenue with me. But if there's a common ledger, essentially, you see what's going on. So we could to more dimensions where you could actually deviate and lie and not report the truth, but then we have more IC constraints floating around, but I don't think it would change the basic insights. I agree with you that credit scores is essentially a way how banks coordinate, saying, oh, who defaulted on previous loans by some other bank, and that the credit score is a tool how to do that. We just think that, you know, these platforms have additional power to better implement that. But credit scores and having a common agreement and a repeated game structure among the banks is also a way to do that. On the dynamic setting, the OLG setting, so what's endogenous and what not. So I think the key insight, there are several insights, but one is essentially if the platform is charging a higher markup, then people tend to go away from the platform, they go somewhere else, they go to the open marketplace. And that means they use cash instead of using IOUs. And so there's less funding for the whole funding structure available. And that increases the interest rate. And so what drives that? So for a given gamma 2, it's just we just do compare, you know, how does the markup change if the bank charge, if the platform charges higher markups, then it will be the case that the interest rate moves, and that also depresses the whole economy essentially. What determines how high a markup a platform wants to change set depends on the gamma 2, because the gamma 2 says how much do people substitute into their public marketplace or not. But I think the more interesting thing is for any gamma 2, you have this effect, essentially. It's just, if you want to quantify it, is in how much will a platform then do it in equilibrium, then it depends on the gamma 2. Perhaps, Jonathan, do you have any, did I miss something or any further thoughts?
Sorry, I'm trying to remember the second question. I think on the first one, I mean, this credit history equilibrium you're describing, I mean, do you see that as a unique equilibrium in the model?
Sorry, so I love this discussion, but let me finish the recorded part and then you're going to continue.
Sure. Sorry.
Because I'm going to kill you with this discussion. It's all my fault. So thanks everyone for participating. Special thanks goes to Markus, to Jonathan and Peter. And next month, we hope to have Will Cong present a data-driven, robust control approach to corporate finance and AI-guided managerial decisions, discussed by Jiang from Emory University. So now we're gonna stop the recorded part of the webinar, and we're gonna move on to putting everybody as panelists, where we can continue the discussion. Thanks so much for joining us, and we wish that you have a great day and join us next week.